shine on us. I don't know if you can shine with bullshit, but I'm gonna go with that at least at the beginning. My name is Greg Elmer. I'm the director of this new space here. It's called the Catalyst at FCAD, which is a wonderful opportunity for all of our researchers and creative faculty to come together under one roof. So hopefully, if you haven't had a chance to kind of walk around and check out all the names and the labs and perhaps some of the things that are happening in this space, I encourage you to do that afterwards, and I'll be around too if you want to talk about what the agenda is for our researchers here. But today, I'm very happy to welcome a good friend of mine, Marc Tuters from the University of Amsterdam. He's got a fantastic talk lined up today that is quite fitting, given that we're, it's just a day or two away or past the midterm elections. So I'm not sure if you have anything lined up to talk about that. But anyway, Marc is affiliated with the Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam. He's also, the director of the Open Intelligence Lab. That's at University of Amsterdam as well. And his current research is focusing on how online subcultures constitute themselves as social movements. So Marc has a prepared talk, and then afterwards we'll have a goodly amount of time to get into a Q&A as well. So welcome, Marc.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for everybody for coming out. I appreciate that this is kind of a quite diverse audience, so I will try to speak both kind of to a more general audience and also hopefully to the kind of media studies type audience that this research is kind of oriented towards. So basically, it's a presentation on fake news, or as I hear people referring to it now, false news. I'm not sure what the distinction is, but I'm actually just calling it bullshit. And the reason for that is because it sells the talk well, so that's one reason. And also because it actually is a technical term in analytic philosophy. It comes from an analytic philosopher by the name of Harry Frankfurt. And it's also kind of a technical term it's become a technical term in I guess you could say in information science as well. So I'm going to get right into it then. So basically in the era of Trump and of the Fords and of rebel media, we find ourselves asking, why is there so much bullshit? So the question sounds glib, but answering it is, in fact, quite complicated. It has to do with a whole variety of factors, and those would include things like the rise of ethnic nationalisms, the spectacularization of politics, the phenomenon of motivated reasoning, where people would rather hear what they would like to hear as opposed to what might otherwise be considered the objective truth. Here I'm going to just talk about one specific example of fake news and look at where it came from. And so I'm actually just going to deal with a little tiny sliver of this big problem, and even a sliver of that. Because the actual story of Pizzagate, some of you may already know about it. I'm not going to really get too much into that. I'm just going to tell you where it came from. So it's the weird story of Pizzagate, and it spread like wildfire across the news media almost exactly 2 years ago, a little bit less than 2 years ago. And what is it that happened 2 years ago tomorrow? Trump was elected. So if some of the details of this odd story have escaped you, I'll kind of catch you up on them. If you really don't know about them, it might come as a bit of a surprise to you. A lot of the talk about fake news these days tends to attribute it to these kind of like, let's call them exotic bad actors, Russian agents, secret agents, and things like that. This thought is at once troubling, but it's also, in a certain sense, kind of comforting, because that way we can locate the problem elsewhere. It's somebody else who's manipulating us. And so I'm not going to say that I don't know for a fact that there weren't, Russians involved in Pizzagate. It's possible. But I'm not going to tell that story. I'm going to tell instead a kind of a story about Pizzagate that we could think of as more like a kind of a homegrown fake news, homegrown example of fake news and bullshit. So to do so, I'm going to have to explain the workings of an obscure part of the internet that many of you might not have ever heard of. And those of you who may have heard of it might still find it quite strange. So I'm going to spend almost more than half the talk kind of trying to introduce you to this thing. It's an online web forum called 4chan. And I'm going to discuss 4chan in terms of, and here I'm going to use two sort of technical terms. I think it's pretty much the only ones. I'm going to discuss it in terms of its affordances, specifically in terms of anonymity and ephemerality, and also its bizarre epistemic culture. And as I say, these are technical terms. They come from the field, my field of media studies, and also from science and technology studies, and I'll hopefully explain those as I go along. So before I even touch on Pizzagate, as I say, the first half is going to deal almost entirely with 4chan, even more than the first half. Okay, before I get started with the 4chan, though, to keep you interested, because it might seem like a rather obscure niche little part of the internet. What's the big deal? Who cares? I'm going to first try to set the sort of bigger stakes of the issue. And I would say that these are kind of, by the time we get to the end of the talk, hopefully this might become clear. So I would say that bullshit's proliferation can be seen to kind of contribute to a situation, also known in, it's a term originally from media studies that's been picked up that you've probably encountered more generally, also known as the filter bubble. And that is the idea, popular amongst, in particular amongst liberal political philosophers, that they consider to be profoundly threatening. The idea that that there is a kind of an undermining, an active undermining that is going on to the foundations of the exercise of public reason. And it is only through the exercise of public reason that we can participate in a liberal society. So the concern is that when we can't tell what's real, and when we don't occupy the same realities anymore, then we'll basically slide into this kind of world. Liberal society will unravel into a kind of world of base tribalism, and we'll lose all of the hard-fought consensus that liberalism has managed to accomplish over the past 50 years or so. So that's the sort of existential threat that is posed by fake news, that we're all going to end up living in separate, fractured realities where we can't actually agree on anything anymore, because we don't have any basic fundamental epistemological shared reality. Okay, so on to the talk. So actually, before I get onto the talk, I'm going to say a little bit more about myself. I'm going to elaborate just a little bit on what Greg started by saying. So the context of my research. So I'm at the University of Amsterdam in New Media and Digital Culture. The program is currently very highly regarded for what it's worth. I'm an assistant professor there. I teach primarily at the graduate level in classes on media theory. I'm currently on a 3-month sabbatical, and Greg has kindly offered to sort of give me a sort of an umbrella in this wonderful space that we're in right now for the moment. The sabbatical is in part thanks to a postdoc that I have with a European Union Horizon 2020 project that's concerned with modeling online political opinion dynamics. And that is a kind of a complicated thing that involves scientists and stuff, and I'm like the only humanities person there, but I do sort of try to negotiate this divide. Integrated into our program at the University of Amsterdam, there's a twice-yearly international research symposium known as the Digital Methods Initiative Summer and Winter School. The next one is actually the beginning of January on the subject of no other than post-truth epistemology. So it's very topical for the talk that I'm giving. And it's in fact led by some of my students. I'm not going to be there because I'm here. But we have some very interesting scholars coming. We have Steve Fuller coming for his new book on post-truth, and Wendy Phillips also has written, who's a scholar on internet trolls, which I will come back to later. So my work is based in the humanities, and methodologically it's kind of an approach that combines close reading, close sort of anthropological, sort of close methodological analysis, and distant reading, so like big data, data science. I am neither. I am neither an anthropologist nor a data scientist. But I do borrow these methods to do the work that I do. And so what we do in this the summer and winter schools that I mentioned a moment ago is we train students how to work with tools, quite simple tools, to to sort of scrape data from social media platforms like Facebook, which I will show you the outcome of in a moment. And the philosophy that sort of underpins this digital methods initiative is expressed by the founder of the thing, Richard Rogers. He refers to it as the idea of digital methods is what he calls online groundedness. And what he means by that, by online groundedness, is that because these days everything happens online, we can kind of ignore the old distinction between the real and the virtual. Okay? With my lab, the Open Intelligence Lab, which has produced this Pizzagate research that I'm going to show you today, our approach is somewhat different than the one I just explained. We're actually interested in studying digital subcultures in particular. So we're actually still attached to the idea that there is something specifically digital. And we're interested in looking at how these digital subcultures become entangled with real-world politics. How it is that weird stuff from the internet kind of spreads out into the world, and vice versa as well. So the question that I've been looking at, that we've been looking at, because I work closely with a number of students who are now colleagues for the past 2 years, actually almost 2 years to the day, is the relationship between these web subcultures and something that you may have heard of called the alt-right, which I will get back to in a moment. So basically summing up all that research from the course of the past 2 years is the objective of my sabbatical. So I'm going to try to write all that up in the next couple of months. Okay, so let's start then. So I'm going to broadly situate my research in relation to this issue of the rise of new right online activism. So after the 2016 Trump election, there was a lot of media attention focused on the so-called alt-right, which I just mentioned a second ago. An NGO that is concerned with like a kind of a watchdog organization that focuses on the right, called Hope Not Hate, has characterized this alt-right as American, but with deep connections to the European New Right and also to web subcultures. And that's what this Venn diagram behind me represents. So I'm quite interested in both the American alt-right and also the European New Right, but our work focuses on, as I'm in new media, our work focuses on web cultures, web subcultures that Hope Not Hate refers to as online antagonistic communities. Maybe I should move out of the way so you guys can see these images. Some of the images are going to be a little detailed, so you might have to squint a little. I'm sorry for that. These online antagonistic communities, what we have looked at, what I've looked at, is how it is that they use internet memes. And so I would actually kind of refer to them more specifically, or I would refer to this phenomenon more specifically, or have done, as mimetic antagonism. So what is a meme? I'm often asked this question. A meme is something that was a term originally coined by Richard Dawkins in the 70s as a kind of a scientific theory of how it is that ideas spread in the world, kind of like his thesis of the selfish gene. It's a kind of an outdated thesis of evolution, that there are these kind of units of the transfer of cultural ideas, and that we can think of fashion and so on as kind of all instances of memes. It's a pretty generally discredited idea, certainly in the humanities, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about internet memes. So what are internet memes? And I'm just going to call them memes because We're just going to forget about the other meme. Internet memes are like humorous, almost always humorous, at least humorous to somebody, user-generated content that is made with an awareness of a specific genre. There are many genres of memes, and the memes are always made with an awareness of that genre. And those memes, those images, they're mostly images, but you could also refer to them. I'm going to be referring to them more in terms of ideas in this case. Generally, we think about them as images, and often we think about them a very particular type of image. They spread virally, so they kind of spread across all the various different platforms on the web, many of which these days are particularly oriented towards images, so it makes sense that images would spread. Since about the 2012 U.S. election, new media theorists have started to discuss the idea of that there is such a thing as political memes. And they kind of theorized a few. I'm not going to get into the examples, but they initially, when they were talking about this, way back in 2012, a really long time ago from the perspective of this particular field, they were conceptualized as a kind of a form of protest, a voice for the voiceless, a way that the marginalized could express dissent against the hegemony of liberalism, which was perceived to diminish the opportunity for expression of marginalized voices. And generally speaking, people who are interested in politics, in activism, this would characterize a certain kind of form of activism that is perhaps in 2012 one might have assumed that would have been progressive, but starting around 2015 or so, maybe slightly earlier for reasons that I'm not going to be able to get into here, there was a shift. There was a shift, and memes, this anti-liberal mimetic antagonism exploded in popularity amongst a kind of a reactionary kind of right group of web pages and areas on the internet, and that's what you're looking at here. I know that for most of you this is going to look like a big blur, but what's on this screen here is a sample from 10,000 separate images. So this is just a very small sample that was taken from the Facebook page of fans of Trump called God Emperor Trump. And there are many pages like this. This was one of the popular ones, but there were many pages like this. And at the time of the election, it was really bananas to look at all this mimetic antagonism on Facebook and how it seemed that really the vast majority of it was kind of in this kind of reactionary, jokey reactionary right area. There was left progressive stuff too. There was Bernie's dank meme stash. I'm not sure who in this audience would be familiar with that, but these guys kind of seemed to me won the day a little bit. At least that's what this story is going to be about. We can talk about why the left can't meme if you want to later. So to give you a sense of how widespread this was in the 2016 election, this is what we call a tree diagram of the most engaged with Facebook posts from all of the pages that we labeled as alt-light. Now, I have to explain several things there. First of all, tree diagram just means that it goes in order from least to most, like this. Most engaged with is the metric that Facebook uses to determine what is kind of trending, what's most important from them. So it has to do with clicking and things like that people do. And alt-light, finally, is kind of a subcategory of the alt-right, or maybe a kind of a paired category to the alt-right that I will elaborate on in just a second. So first of all, how did we choose these pages? That was an interesting thing, actually, because I never thought I would be working in this type of situation. But I was approached by the Home Office, the extremism unit of the Home Office of the UK government, because of the research that I was doing, and they gave me a list of. Maybe I shouldn't go any further with that. Let's just say that I got an expert list. And so I used this list to come up with a number of pages that we then determined were they were referred to as alt-light by the experts. That's how come they're there. And what you see on this tree diagram is that Milo Yiannopoulos, who was a famous figure at the time, shows up very prominently, as does Breitbart, a website and news site that perhaps you're familiar with. And this Breitbart site, which actually hired Milo Yiannopoulos, was found by scholars after the 2016 election to have really kind of played a key role in framing the tone of the election. It was, in case you know this name, it was managed by a guy by the name of Steve Bannon, who was just, I'm sure you know, he was just at the Roy Thompson Hall the other day. Maybe I'll come back to that. So the alt-right then, they kind of engage in, their thing is a critique of political correctness and a critique of liberalism more generally. And they would distinguish themselves from the alt-right as who are kind of openly racist. And they are rather kind of concerned with, the alt-right would be more like proponents of Western values and things like that. But it has been said that precisely because they actually appear less threatening, the alt-right are in fact kind of a greater threat. At least it's a kind of, you could say it's a kind of like a gateway maybe. And for this reason they might, and this is also actually, I know from speaking to like right-wing people who have like defected. I met somebody because I've gone to some of these hate speech conferences. I was told that the hard right looks to the sort of soft figures as pawns. So you could think of them as maybe useful idiots. That's a term that you might, for normalizing the more extreme agenda of the alt-right that involves things like the return of discredited 19th century ideas of race science and things like that. Okay, so where does this style of mimetic antagonism come from? That's the question. Well, so I would say consistent with the European New Right from the previous slide, the European New Right's metapolitical argument that politics is downstream from culture. That's actually a slogan that Breitbart would often promote. Politics is downstream from culture. So consistent with that idea, journalists and alt-right activists alike have claimed that there is a culture war underway. And if this is true, that there's an online culture war underway, because there was a culture war back in the 90s, remember, with Pat Buchanan and people like that in the States, and Piss Christ, and I'm not sure if these are reference points for people. So if there is currently a culture war underway again, an online culture war, if this is true, then 4chan would represent the strategic high ground to be captured, which is ironic because 4chan is explicitly lowbrow, but it would represent the strategic high ground to be captured in a culture war. And the reason for this is that 4chan has long been known as the source of viral web culture. So I will now give you a fabulous vernacular diagram of the mimetic hype cycle, which is modeled on the Gartner hype cycle of technology, which is known by technology promoters and Silicon Valley types. And the Gartner hype cycle, which is on the right here, you don't really need to read it, but you can see at least maybe the shape. It goes like this. You have the peak of inflated expectations. This is usually applied to new technologies. Then you go through the trough of disillusionment. So the early adopters is the peak. Then you go through the trough of disillusionment. Then you ramp up to the slope of enlightenment, and finally the plateau of productivity. That is supposed to be the life cycle of any successful technology. So this diagram in the middle is kind of like a quotation of that. So in this diagram, 4chan triggers the innovation. So that's the peak. And that would be such things as, maybe some of you guys know this, even the normies. There's lolcats, rickrolling. Perhaps you've heard of Pepe the Frog. So these are all memes that came from 4chan. And I wouldn't say that this is an accurate representation of like media ecology, but it does symbolize what we could call a kind of a subcultural imaginary of the web. So, so people who are really into, this is basically an image of how it is that people who are really into memes, really into kind of dank memes, imagine the relationship of the various parts of the web. So it starts with 4chan, then it goes to Reddit, which is the peak. Then it goes on to 9gag, which is the trough. Then it arrives at Facebook, which is the slope. And then finally YouTube, which is the plateau. And then they add one more thing on the bottom of the image here. There's a sort of a forking path. And this is not in the original hype cycle. It goes in two directions. One direction, it ends up going to a place called Know Your Meme. It could also go to something else called Encyclopedia Dramatica. And that is, and then below that it says, or next to it, it says, beside Know Your Meme, which is a kind of a website that archives meme culture, because a lot of this stuff is ephemeral, which I will come back to. It says Internet Historian. That's me. That's us. So on the one hand, it goes to Internet Historian. On the other hand, the other fork, it goes to, it says here, Out of the Loop, Mass Media, and then below that it says Mass Hysteria. So as you know, or as you will soon know, Pizzagate is an example of this mass hysteria category. But I'm now presenting it on the other end as from the Internet Historian perspective. So in our research, we've actually studied all of these platforms, except for 9gag, which I'm not very interested in. Maybe I should be. But I'm going to just focus on 4chan. You saw a little bit about Facebook. I'm just going to focus on 4chan now. Okay. Oh, yeah. But before I do that, a couple more things about history, about web history. So 4chan really can be seen as fitting into a kind of a timeline of web history. This is a very DIY timeline of web history. Not only is 4chan the home of memes, but it's also the home of the proverbial internet troll. So a question might be, what is that? What is trolling? There might be different answers for that, but I think one answer is that it is a subcultural practice that's been part of the internet since before the web. So many of my students, they write, in fact, I had a graduate student who wrote this just the other day, they think that the internet and the web are the same thing. They're not. The web actually started here. Before that, there was already other stuff, other kind of social media that was going on that wasn't the web, and the trolls were there already before that in the early days. So their motto, the motto of the trolls, is the following: Internet is serious business. Which is to say that it is not, and that anybody who thinks it is fooling themselves, because it is not a legitimate forum for the expression of serious ideas, serious politics, and in fact it is the opposite of that. It's really just a kind of a big playground. So trolls, basically you could say trolls still believe in the idea, which we in our field actually have considered to be sort of outdated for a while. We think of it as an embarrassing early relic of the 90s. They still believe in the idea that there is a distinction between the real world of work and the virtual world of the internet. They still believe in that. They still cherish that idea. They still hold on to that idea. That's the idea that cyberspace is a kind of a world apart from the rest of the world. The very thing that the Digital Methods Initiative that I said before said that it was beyond, we were beyond that. So in this sense, if you look at this graph here, this historical graph, you see, I will just sort of very briefly translate it to you. You see we have bulletin boards, then early net culture, then we have something called Something Awful and the Chan boards. I'll come back to that in a second. Out of that comes 4chan. The Johnny-come-lately is social media, and there is, you can see a kind of a, you can conceptualize a kind of a cleavage between, on the one hand, the world of 4chan and the trolls and the world of social media, which I sometimes have referred to as the distinction, as a kind of a heuristic, a very simple kind of heuristic, as a distinction between what I've written here as the deep vernacular web as opposed to the mainstream surface web. So the residents of the trolls, the residents who perceive of themselves, whether or not this is correct, who perceive of themselves as the residents of the deep vernacular web see themselves as the true web natives. And this is a term often used in new media to refer to a generation who grew up online, web native. But that's not what they're referring to. They're referring to themselves as the ones who have a history, a cultural history that goes back to before this kind of social media colonial land grab that they feel is happening and that is taking away or is sort of commodifying their culture, including their memes. So this historical perspective is important, I think, to bring us back to that right-wing stuff that I was speaking about before, in helping to account for why they've been attracted to the right-wing populist narrative of replacement. This term that you hear sometimes from the European New Right that was repeated by in the Charlottesville event a year and something ago. This idea of replacement. So this is how it is that many of them seem, at least for a while, to have come to idealize Trump as a kind of an avatar of their resentment at being replaced. So, as I say, 4chan came out of, well, I didn't mention this, it came out, I'm not going to get too much into it, but it has a history, it comes out of actually Japanese image culture, and another thing called Something Awful, which is kind of like an American gross out thing. And, but it's technically based on an open source framework. So it's not, although it is a business, it's not a very successful business. They don't have any business model, basically, because nobody wants to advertise there for reasons that you will understand in a moment. And it's basically all open source, which means that it can be copied and forked. It can be, somebody can just take the whole thing and make a new version of it if they want to. There's not really anything that can be done to stop that. So there is, in this image, which is totally incomprehensible, it represents the kind of Chanverse, the entire Chanverse out there in the world. And there are many different languages, in fact. There's Russian, there's Brazilian, there are many languages in the Chanverse, but the most popular of these is 4chan, which is about half of the posts that go to that come the IP addresses from which the posts originate on 4chan come from either the States, Canada, or the UK. And the way that these things work is that they are discussion forums. And as discussion forums, they're very, very simple. And they have separate discussion boards, kind of like Facebook pages, but without any of the graphic user interface. And they're on different topics. So there's, anime, Japanese image culture, video games, all the kind of stuff that people who spend a lot of time at their computers are into. It has about 1 million posts per day. That is 4chan. So that makes it the biggest of the chans. And for a long time, and this is just a representation from not too long ago of the most popular boards. You see in black, this highest graph line represents one of the boards. The other ones are also indicated color-coded. So for a long time, the most successful, the most popular of the discussion boards was B, which stands for random. And quite a bit has been written about that. It's very interesting. I don't have time to get into it, but it did have maybe like a slight association with like progressive culture. Today, the biggest board is POL, P-O-L, which stands for politically incorrect. And this board was actually initially started in order to contain, let's say, unsavory political discussion that was sort of sprawling across the other boards, including B. So it was started as a quote-unquote containment board, and yet it has become the most successful one. So if you look at 4chan, it will look strange. Many of you, I would assume, will have no idea what you're seeing. So I'm going to show it to you. I opened it up here. So the first thing you get is some attempt at advertising. Then there's a rules of rational discourse because they see them, they're sort of logic pedants, and they're very much preoccupied with the idea that everything has to be reasonable and rational, which is ironical because it's far from that. And then there's some rules for how you're supposed to use the board, and then you get into the currently most popular post. So the way that it works is that it almost always has a meme here, and then you'll see that this is the name of the poster. Their name is anonymous. And then there's the next comment that has been made from somebody else whose name is also anonymous. And then another one, and so on and so on and so on until you get to the next post, which is something about the Trump press conference and kicking Jim Acosta out. And then there's another one. And interestingly, if I were to refresh the page, you will see probably that, look, it's not the same post at the top of the page anymore. It's a different post. In fact, so is even the second one is not the same. Even the third one's not the same. So I'll come back to why that is in a second. Okay. So when analyzing mimetic antagonisms, I'm going to say that we have to take into account affordances. We have to take something called affordances into account. And the most well-known of these affordances, which we could say are the kind of technical design characteristics of the website, the most well-known of 4chan's particular affordances is its anonymity. As you just saw a second ago, all the people who had posted, they didn't have handles, they didn't even have pseudonyms, they were just anonymous. So that's what is the best known thing about 4chan. And it kind of leads to this sort of anything goes attitude, because anyone can post anything and nobody knows who you are. And every time that you log off and log on, you get a new trip code. There's a very small amount of identification that occurs. Probably the NSA, I'm sure, might know more. I don't know. You'd have to ask Greg about that. But in any case, it's relatively anonymous. So this means what's important about this is that this means that unlike in social media, even unlike in pseudonymous social media, but especially unlike in Facebook, you have no portable reputational capital. You can't bring anything with you to show that you are the person that you claim to be. You have to demonstrate that. You have to perform that anew every time with your speech, basically, which can also be memes. So that's a very important distinction about what it is that makes 4chan the way that it is. I hope that's clear. So I will, if it's not clear, I will try to elaborate on it now. So in the absence of any portable reputational capital, nobody knows who you are, they don't know what you've done, what you've said. You have to demonstrate your belonging, your in-group belonging, the fact that you are a member of the community, that you're not some random outsider, that you can keep up with the conversation and add to it. And that is done through all kinds of weird coded language that's constantly changing. There's a whole lexicon of words constantly evolving and changing. It's very innovative from a kind of a computational linguistic perspective, but also that is done through memes, through people using memes. You start a post with a meme, you usually respond with a meme. Memes are used to demonstrate emotions. They're used as kind of reaction images. So memes offer kind of these like fixed formats or grammars that can vary depending on the instance. So they can have lots of different novel meanings within this kind of this rather simple set of constraints. So this is just like the top 200 images categorized by color value from a day on poll. So all of the images that you saw there, it kind of interlaced with the text, those extracted. And what you can see, because you can't see much, but what you can see here is you can see a green region. I think most people can see that there's a green region here. And what is that green region? Any guesses? Pepe. Pepe. Okay, so that is Pepe. So Pepe is in fact the most popular meme on poll in terms of a particular meme genre. And it's also, interestingly, the most popular, from what I could tell, on the international chans as well. So it's kind of got an international, it travels, let's say. It is often used as a reaction meme, so it's used to express emotional states, various different emotional states, all kinds of emotional states. And in this sense, meme like Pepe is a little bit like an emoji. I think everybody here knows about emojis. But what's important and distinct about memes is that there is no standardizing authority as opposed to with emojis. They have to kind of go through a process to get into the sort of dictionary, and there's nothing like that for memes. So they're kind of the Wild West. And here you can't probably see what's going on with all the various Pepes, but trust me, there are as many different possible interpretations of Pepe as you could imagine. And so in this sense, it's kind of, you could think of it as a floating signifier. The idea of a sign that can be used to express almost anything. But it does have some kind of a connection to subculture. And, so if it's a floating signifier, if it can be used to express almost anything, then it's interesting that in the summer of 2016, so a little more than 2 years ago, the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, put Pepe into its database of hate symbols. And the reason for this was that it was used in combination with Nazi imagery. And actually, that's visible here. If you look, you can see some instances of that mixed in there. So channers, or as they refer to themselves, anons, people who are on 4chan, anons, they might have a different interpretation for what's going on here with this Nazi Pepe. As with, for example, 1970s punk rock, there are subcultural reasons for playing with Nazi imagery. Anons relish the idea of triggering those people who take the internet seriously. Remember when I mentioned before the philosophy of the internet trolls? So they relish the idea that they would trigger us with that image. Not that makes it excusable, but that might explain what's going on there, their interpretation. Beyond this, they can be understood as these kind of tasteless attempts to inoculate Pepe against recuperation. Pepe started to become, it was always a 4chan thing, and then celebrities like Katy Perry and people like that started using it, and then they were like, well, we're going to make it so that nobody's going to want to use this again. So that's one way to make it that nobody's going to want to use it again. And then, way more obscurely, this might be a bit of a stretch, it could possibly be a reference to what is called in internet culture, on forum culture, Godwin's law of the internet, which says that all discussions that take place on the internet, on forums like 4chan, will inevitably turn into flame wars, and flame wars will inevitably descend into comparisons to Hitler. So maybe they're just kind of going straight to the end of that law. Okay, so here I come to a visualization of the ephemerality of 4chan, which is the other main affordance of 4chan. So because of 4chan's relative simplicity, it's easier to visualize its dynamics than it would be with other social media platforms. You really get like a view of what's going on 4chan. It's much harder to do with the big social media platforms. They're also all closed down and harder to get access to. So what we're seeing here is a visualization of the ephemerality on 4chan, and 4chan actually has no official archive, but there is an archive that we use called Archive for Plebs, and this represents 1 hour of 4chan. This is all of the posts that happen on 4chan in 1 hour, and I'm going to try to explain this to you very quickly. So, as I say, the design of 4chan is quite simple. Anons post comments, often with memes. These are posted to ongoing discussions, and those discussions start with one post, which is called an original post. That's the basics of 4chan. Very simple. Now what happens after that is that these threaded discussions, within these threaded discussions, the one with the most recent comment, the one that is the most kind of active, will appear in first order at the top of the board. So that's why when I clicked on it, suddenly you couldn't see the previous thing because somebody had posted to another discussion and then that moved up, okay? And I think that you see this visualized in this image here. So what the effect of this is that previous threads get pushed down by whatever is the current thread that's being commented on. So it's like, imagine it like a kind of a torrent that is constantly washing everything away. And the only way that anything can kind of stay up above water, or at least in this metaphor, kind of upstream, is by getting new comments and new activity. Otherwise, it's going to get pushed down from the first page to the second page until eventually it will disappear altogether, actually. So while a thread is bumped to the top of the board by getting a constant stream of comments, boards are designed so that after a thread reaches a certain number of comments, it can no longer stay at the top of the page no matter how many comments it receives. So even the most popular discussions on 4chan, they're totally blowing up. There's just an inbuilt limit because they want it to be ephemeral, so it'll just eventually disappear. So the combination of 4chan's unique affordances of anonymity and of ephemerality bring up the third factor, which is more like a kind of a cultural practice of 4chan. And this is where we finally get to Pizzagate, because Pizzagate is an instance of what I'm about to tell you, and that is called a general thread. So in order to fight against this ephemerality, in order to fight against the fact that everything gets pushed down and there's inbuilt limits to what can remain on 4chan, what Anons do is they copy and paste old content into new threads in order to keep the discussion going. So once the most popular thread reaches its limit, you just copy and paste stuff into a new one, and then it's as though that thread were still continuing again. So I don't know if you can see this here, but there's one blue line here. Amongst all of the descending lines, there's one single blue line that goes back up there. That's a general thread. So that's somebody who has copied this text, and then later on in that hour, it starts a new thread. Everything else just disappears. So together, these factors that I've explained to you guys today, they can be seen to kind of meaningfully shape what goes on 4chan, to grammatize the actions and the collective actions of 4chan. And because 4chan's the track record, because of its track record as being the home of memes, as I mentioned earlier, in some cases, these things that happen, that these conversations that start to get going through general threads on 4chan, in some cases they can spread. And in the remaining time, I'll show you how it is that one such sort of mimetic, antagonistic conversation was born on 4chan out of one of these generals, and that general goes by the name of Pizzagate. So, finally we've arrived at Pizzagate. This part's going to be briefer than the previous part. It was a long walk to get here. Okay, so thank you for your patience. So what's Pizzagate? So it was a story that went viral exactly 2 years ago, maybe about 2 years and 2 days ago. 3 or 4 days ago, featuring the Clintons, Satanism, and pedophilia. And much has been written on, this is a screenshot that I took a month or something ago. I just took the top images from Google Images for Pizzagate. This is what it shows you. Basically what I just said. Satanism, pizza, pedophilia, art, kind of transgressive art. So a lot has been written on the dissemination of Pizzagate as a conspiracy theory. There were exposés in big ones in Rolling Stone, in New York Times, Washington Post, etc. Basically every major media outlet. To the best of my knowledge, we were the first to systematically tell the story of its origins. So this research represents the first kind of investigation into how it occurred as opposed to how it spread. Basically, as it turns out, all of the kind of key elements, or at least two of the very significant elements, which you still see when you type in Pizzagate as being represented, the Satanism and the pizza part, came together in the period of a single day on 4chan poll. And very briefly, I will show you how this happened. Okay, so on November the 3rd, 2016, Anons were combing through a cache of private emails that had been obtained by hackers. I said I wasn't going to say the Russian part, but probably Russian hackers, leaked by Julian Assange, belonging to Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta. And it seems that the Clintons and Podesta, the Clinton team, the campaign team, would often go out for pizza at a local DC pizza parlor. And that pizza parlor, its owner had ties to an influential political consultant within the Democratic Party, who's a slightly controversial person, at least to Republicans. So this is basically the story of the elite political class, right? That's central to the populist narrative. That was one of the big points that Bannon made in his talk at the Roy Thompson Hall the other day. That was his best point. On poll, this single connection became the linchpin for the whole narrative. So here we see a key moment in the construction of that narrative. When they mention you can't really see it, but just take my word for it. In Podesta's emails, there's mention of the phrase cheese pizza, and that is treated as a clue by the Anons. So you can note here, actually at the bottom, for those of you who can read here, one Anon coyly asks, "What is this a code word for?" And what he's referring to there is the fact that the term cheese pizza on 4chan is in fact a code word for child pornography. So we can't tell here if this is a joke or if it's serious. And part of the reason for that is because of the trolling epistemology that I mentioned to you before. In a way, on 4chan, in the deep vernacular web, everything is a joke. But in any case, it's also, for us as researchers or for outsiders in general, sort of impossible to know, and that is because of another famous internet law known as Poe's law, which basically claims that also when you're on a forum, on the internet, you can't really distinguish between irony and sincerity when people are getting kind of worked up about things. So it's pretty much impossible for us to know if these people are taking themselves seriously. Here's another example that fed into the fantasy of the corrupt democratic establishment. This is another email. This is the actual email leaked from, apologies to the people whose private emails these are, but it's now sort of part of the public record. This was another email sent to Podesta from the artist Marina Abramovich, and there is a reference in this email to one of her art projects entitled Spirit Cooking, which is a bleak, kind of a not so bleak reference to the mid-century English cultist Aleister Crowley, and basically a satanic ritual, which was the name of her art project. And so this was interpreted as more evidence of the Clintons' involvement in actual satanic rituals. And I would mention here that Hillary and the Democrats were, the idea that they were literal, quote, literal Satanists is a favorite statement of Alex Jones. He would say that all the time on his YouTube channel, and he had a great many more followers than what we could expect in the number of people who are involved in this particular general thread. So here it is. These are the 20 general threads. This is the sort of center attraction that we found on Pizzagate, on poll, that all occurred within a 25-hour period in which the Anons connected all the basic elements of the narrative. And so they did, in a sense, discover the thing about pizza, and they did sort of discover the Satanism thing, but they connected many elements that had also been lying around. Some of these elements were a few years old. One of them was Sex Island, or otherwise known as Orgy Island, which I must say that my friend's dad, right before the election, said, "How could you vote for Hillary? She went to Orgy Island." So that was a thing. And others, so some of them were a few years old, and they kind of got, there was a sort of a substrate of conspiracy that Alex Jones was kind of circulating that was already there, that the Pizzagate thing got kind of pinned onto. Others were like decades old. Hillary Clinton already in '98, you might remember she'd spoken of the vast right-wing conspiracy against her and Bill. So this is a visualization of how Pizzagate was born and spread in the course of a day. And basically, actually, the first people to have found it were, in fact, earlier when the emails were first leaked earlier in October, but it didn't actually, so it was, in that sense, the emails were leaked as an October surprise, as it's referred to in American politics, but it wasn't until they weren't rediscovered until this moment that I'm telling you now on November the 2nd, when they were first mentioned. Pizzagate as a term was first mentioned on 4chan poll. There was a discussion that had previously gone on 8chan, which is a kind of a more extreme version of 4chan that is linked to. Within an hour, it showed up on the Donald, which is a subreddit that was with about 500,000 rabid Trump supporters. Then within a few hours, there was the first mention of the pizza parlor. Then they started compiling all of their research, not only into general threads, but into something called Pastebin, which is like a kind of a service where people put data that is archived as opposed to 4chan, which is not archived. Then you have within a few more hours the first attempt to make a kind of iconographic representation of it. Then it shows up on Our Conspiracy, and that's basically the end of the story. It disappears from 4chan after that for mysterious reasons. So while 4chan and Paul produce bullshit like this all the time, this kind of stuff is not unique. This particular thing happened just days before the election. And so you can imagine that there was a kind of a transactional aspect. There's a demand for bullshit out there. And so as soon as 4chan created Pizzagate, the Pizzagate narrative migrated to, as I say, to the Donald community on Reddit, and it would become massively amplified in this sort of what's been referred to as the new right-wing media sphere by some media scholars on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, even reaching as far as the Oval Office with the U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, who got fired right after that. Although it was almost immediately discredited by many credible organizations, the Washington Post and so forth. A reputable poll at the time found that about half of Trump voters gave some sort of credence to this rumor. So that's what I mentioned, the anecdote that I mentioned. The story would continue, interestingly. So I hear that you don't hear about the caravan on Fox News now that the midterms are over, but this story kept on going after the election. In fact, it picked up steam and it kept on rolling after Trump got elected. And I think it would have kept on going if not for the fact that somebody kind of broke sort of a rule of this type of bullshit. A man drove halfway across the United States with a semi-automatic rifle, acting logically on what he thought he was reading about, and went to, quote unquote, self-investigate the pizza parlor to free the enslaved children in the basement. And there was no basement in the pizza parlor. And so this became an immediate, huge international news story. And then the Pizzagate promoters, including Alex Jones, backed away from the story. They all sort of tried to pretend like they never had anything to do with it. And I think that's very interesting. And why is it? Why did that happen? Why was there that shift? And I think that the point is that the point of this kind of bullshit is just to create innuendo, just to create sort of chaos and nonsense. It's not supposed to be taken as actual fact. So that whole post-fact thing is a little sort of off in that sense. Okay, so this is, I think, my second last slide. So because of its unique epistemic culture, 4chan, as it turns out, is extremely good at creating bullshit. For the most part, the general threads remain are a relatively benign feature of 4chan. It's just people trying to keep the conversation going. But in the case of Pizzagate, it took the process of a real-time collective research effort in bullshit accumulation. And this is a representation of that bullshit accumulation process. So we categorize, this is where the kind of anthropological part comes in. We categorized all the posts into 5 different categories. So you could see that what they would do is that they would do research, they would link to primary sources, secondary sources, discuss the sources, they would do interpreting, they would kind of critique what was going on there, they would use various different kinds of third-party tools, they would solicit calling for action, calling for expertise to make sense of the research that they had found. And then because of the ephemerality of 4chan, they were also involved in a big archiving effort. So they would use paste bin links, they would use various different kinds of Google Docs and things like that to compile the information, keep track of it. And finally, they would publish this material to sort of promote it out to the world. And in so doing, they would make visualizations. And so in the process of researching this, we actually noticed quite an uncanny resemblance to our own methods of research, actually. Or at least the digital methods style of research. And in particular, the use of visualizations is very popular in this digital methods research that I mentioned at the beginning, in order to visualize large and complex sets of data. So already in the first few hours, if you could see the top left there, one of the Anons says, "My brain is exploding, trying to organize the connections. Does anyone have any diagrams?" So that's what this is. And this is actually what got me interested in Pizzagate in the first place when I found this. I thought, what the hell is going on in this image? So Anons produced a whole slew of conspiracy visualizations. One such instance is a map of all of the child-related businesses near the DC Pizza Parlor, whose logos, first aligned, of course, into a pentagram, whose logos seemed similar to the symbols apparently used to communicate to one another by pedophiles. So there's apparently a whole kind of hobo language that is used by pedophiles. And so I think, this is kind of it. Could anybody actually believe in something like this? Is this even possible? And, well, we know the answer. Yes, in fact, a man did come with a gun and tried to expose this. While Anons might claim that they're into Pizzagate, the Anons on 4chan might claim that they're only into Pizzagate for the lulz, for the laughs, for the ironic kind of pleasure, maybe for triggering people. It's outside of 4chan. It's outside of that particular epistemic culture, when it kind of spreads outside of 4chan, that it can kind of change and become more serious. So Trump-loving normies, as 4chan refers to them, the people on the Donald, on Reddit, the people with many different YouTube channels, Facebook pages, they don't have, or at least in the eyes of Anons, they don't have the same ironic relationship to this stuff. They don't have the same ironic, lulzy relationship to belief. So in spreading to social media, the open-endedness of 4chan's floating signifiers like Pizzagate, they kind of close down, they sort of shut down, and they just become one thing. And this is the reason that 4chan Anons actually tend to reject memes once they're successful and they've spread outside of 4chan, because it's not sort of many different things anymore. It's kind of like, it's just shut down into one thing. This is my last slide. So we've called that process, the process that I just said, that closing down process, we've referred to that as normification. And you can see that happening in another 4chan conspiracy theory called QAnon. And that's a continuation of the Pizzagate story that you can read about on this blog, the Oil Lab blog. And you'll also find a link to a short academic text of this talk on that blog as well. So very, very briefly, QAnon imagines Trump as, in fact, working together in cahoots with Mueller to root out corruption and, of course, pedophilia, which is endemic in the US political establishment. And it has signs of, and markers and posters and T-shirts of QAnon were all throughout the Trump rallies in earlier this fall. So if this strikes you as ridiculous, then you should know that this strange idea that I just told you of QAnon, this is part of 4chan's game. You could think of it as a kind of a live action role playing take on politics. And so I don't think it's purely a joke. It's kind of more complex than that. It's sort of like they're imagining a reality that suits their fantasies. Whether or not they believe in that is kind of a more complex thing. They have a complex relationship with belief. But I think that as long as these memes are within 4chan, they're actually relatively harmless. And that's because of the affordances of 4chan, the ephemerality and the anonymity and the bizarre epistemic culture in which everything is play. I don't think that 4chan, because of those factors, is particularly conducive to the formation of coherent political ideologies. So I don't actually see it in that sense as a major kind of threat. And besides, yes, it is extremely gross and tasteless, but what are we going to do? You know, what are you supposed to do about that? Are you supposed to censor it or something? It'll just fork, as it did with 8chan. There will just be another one. And when Pizzagate arrived on Reddit, Pizzagate was censored from Reddit, and then it moved to Vote. Similarly with this Twitter, right-wing Twitter Gab. And there's actually kind of a case that paradoxically, when you sort of try to stamp them out and then they move to these more kind of extreme places, that it actually has the effect of concentrating extremism. That may have been what happened with Gab, with those two recent white nationalist terror attacks earlier, like last week. So I think that the real problem here is a kind of reactionary, atavistic politics that seems to license these fantasies more generally in the culture. And the narrative that connects potentially legitimate grievances, for example, the idea of the failure of the political class, with fantasies of how things used to be before it was that they, which is their term for all of the people that they're opposed to, stole our joy. That's the thing to be concerned about, this reactionary, atavistic politics of the moment. Thank you. Thanks, eh?
Okay, we've got some time for questions. If someone wants to get us rolling, way at the back of the room. I can't even see that who that is.
Why can't the left meme?
Oh, okay, right. I did bring that one on, didn't I? That is, of course, the big question that everybody would like to know the answer to. And I think that I've thought about it a bit, and I don't know that I have like a great answer, but maybe one of the answers would have to do with something about the nature of humor, and that humor, the darker humor, is more tends to the reactionary, and where it may be in a moment where, to go a little further into a kind of slightly unsafe statement, that we're in a moment in progressive culture where the idea of unsafe spaces would be very problematic. So that would be a deficit in that sense, to being able to sort of have as dank memes.
Yeah. I actually have a second question. It's not as much of a follow-up, but I was wondering, you said about, I think you used the word colonization to describe how they feel about social media sites, and like definitely we as communication scholars talk about the enclosure of the internet, but I'm sure that they don't use the word colonization.
No.
So I was wondering, how do you know that they have these feelings about social media?
Well, I mean, they are extremely populist in their rhetoric. And so they definitely can be seen as participating in that phenomenon. And it is, I mean, like, for example, the blog post that you can read on the blog there about the meme "they" is a very good example of that. And that whole kind of us-them antagonism that imagines this kind of like a fantasy of a pure earlier time that is being contaminated is very much part of the European right, which actually has kind of recuperated aspects of critique, certain kinds of critical concepts that would normally be associated with kind of like a left political agenda. So the idea, so it's actually like Marine Le Pen and people like that, or at least the kind of gurus of that movement do use that kind of language in speaking about defending the sort of the sort of authentic people of their part of their nation from this kind of multicultural neoliberal agenda. So it's actually quite interesting how they've incorporated a lot of that language into this sort of far right, new kind of far right populism. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, Safran.
Yeah, I guess like going off of what Olivia said, and this might be more of like a linguistic question, but I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about Pepe as a grammar, like, and that, yeah, never thought I'd say that, but yeah, like, because you said like it's always a 4chan thing, and like they're using it to make sure they like give it these negative connotations to make sure no one wants to use it again. But I was curious about, because it didn't originate on 4chan. So what do you think the differences in like semiotic appropriation, I guess, are between taking it from a comic, from a guy, Matt Fury, who's really left and like has denounced a bunch of this stuff, versus 4chan trying to wall it off?
Yeah, I know the Pepe Frog meme came from a comic book, and it was a sort of an underground, it was like this hapless loser guy. And then it was initially taken up by 4chan as a kind of a representation of their identity as losers. You know, it was the same with, by the way, Guy Fawkes is also a loser. And it was taken up as this kind of symbol of a loser, and then it kind of went through the same kind of transformation a little bit, except for a slightly different end, where it became recoded with different kinds of meanings. And I know that that the original author was very upset because of the fact that it had been, said to have become a hate symbol. I'm not sure that it is correct to say that Pepe is a hate symbol. I mean, it is a hate symbol in certain contexts, and that's for sure. There's like no question about that. But so he wanted to get this thing back from the internet, and I guess it's like you can't do that, can you? When Barbara Streisand tried to get her house delisted from Google Images, it doesn't sort of work, does it? So I think once the internet kind of gets a hold of it, there's not much you can do. But I don't think that it was correct. It's a funny thing to, I think, study from a semiotic perspective, these memes. In fact, I would say, since I mentioned this before, the most interesting meme to study from a semiotic perspective is actually this one, the echo brackets, which has an extremely unpleasant history, because it is a meme whose signifier you can see right there inside of the brackets. So it's quite interesting to take a semiotic perspective in studying memes, but I think that you have to probably also really take a kind of a subcultural perspective to understand what's going on with that stuff. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I gave it a shot.
It's interesting.
Okay, so there's a question here, and then next.
Yeah, so at the end there, you kind of started talking about how, you don't believe the 4chan memes to be harmful in any way, that they're harmless when they're sitting on their threads and stuff like that. But, I mean, we also talked about, at the beginning of your talk, that there is a tendency for it to spill or to leak, to become new forms of speech that end up making cultural shifts. And you even brought up somebody who brought up the Clinton Orgy Island, and that was affecting their voting.
Yeah.
And, Pizzagate, that's an effect that comes into the real world.
Yeah.
And as well, that kind of goes along with this kind of new understanding of internet technology technology that we have, right? That there is kind of no more separation between the body and technology, but instead there's kind of this interflow between subjectivity, I guess, that we're seeing with cases like with Pizzagate. So I guess I was wondering if you could talk more on that and where we see, I guess, challenges in, you know, working with internet users' understanding of the internet as being something that is removed from their true self or their true political self, and you know, our kind of understanding that it actually does read into the real world and where we can kind of move forward with those ideas. And stuff like that.
Very difficult. I think that the people who, you know, as I mentioned, 4chan makes this kind of stuff all the time, and it's totally gross. The poll board is totally gross. It's extremely racist. It's extremely anti-Semitic. It's basically everything the worst you could imagine. So, you know, nobody's going to go on there and say it's not, like, extremely offensive. But I think that where it becomes... why I said that I think that it's relatively harmless is because I think that it doesn't... it can't... What I said after that is that I don't think that it kind of can support any kind of coherent political project. I know that there was a time when there were activists who were coming out of 4chan, B, and that would maybe be a counter-argument, but I don't see it, at least as it stands at the moment, as supporting that. So where I think what is a little bit more capable of that are these kind of people who, in the case, for example, of Pizzagate, the people who promoted Pizzagate, who these kind of minor right-wing pundits, alt-right pundits, people like, see if I can think of any Canadians, Pettibone, and what's her name?
Stefan Molyneux.
Stefan Molyneux is another good one. There's that woman who used to be on Rebel.
Oh, Faith Golden?
Yeah. She didn't, I don't know if she promoted Pizzagate, but I wouldn't be surprised if she did. And those guys are, they can be kind of held accountable, I think, and they spread this kind of nonsense. And so I would say that and they kind of translate it from, and they make it sort of real, I think. And there's a whole ecosystem of YouTube channels and and subreddits that are like devoted to, for example, so Pizzagate's kind of dead, but with the other one, QAnon, there's like a whole ecosystem that sort of translates this stuff to normies. And that, I think, is where there I think is something that could be like dealt with a bit more if you want to try to get to the issue. I don't think that going to the source in 4chan is really going to. They're sort of beyond hope, I guess. I would just put it like that. So that you could, you know, frame it, since we're in a communications department, you could kind of think about a certain kind of like media literacy approach, I think, to this kind of stuff. When we were coming over here, we had a Uber driver. I don't know if I should be ashamed to say that or not. I don't ever use it where I come from, but who was saying like, what is your? He was a very, very nice guy, and he was like, what are you gonna? My dad was sort of promoting my father over there was promoting me, and then he's like, what is your talk about? And I was like, oh. And then I told him what it was about, and he was like, I've never heard of that. And he's like, well, maybe my son has heard of it. And I was like, I don't know if your son wants to know about that. And I don't know exactly how to deal with that thing, because I wouldn't want to be the person who would send his son who's in grade 9, is probably exactly the right age, to that place. But I also don't think that it should be, like, he should probably know maybe about what that thing is. And, you know, just like the old-fashioned way, you know, you have conversations about these things. I think we have a good tradition in this field of media literacy, and there's probably quite a bit of media literacy that could be done around the deep vernacular web and around kind of being able to sort of bring a little bit of transparency into these places to understand a little bit about what is going on, and also so as not to get triggered by some of their like really lame attempts to get people agitated.
David.
Thank you. My question was kind of similar, so maybe it just counts as the same and has the same answer. But my thought went along the lines of you take 4chan seriously enough to study it.
Yes.
But then you kind of end up saying it's mostly harmless. Whereas I've not taken it seriously enough to study it, and I've never looked at 4chan because what I know about 4chan is just that it's horrible, and I don't want to look at it in that kind of way. But like, I know about it as a source of like in the Gamergate scenario. I don't know if you know the whole story of Gamergate, and I won't try to say it all, but it was a thing where basically they just hugely ganged up on women in video games in general and subject them to massive sexual harassment, which is kind of orchestrated through 4chan as far as I know. That
correct.
just sounds awful.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's not harmless.
No, and he did. You're absolutely correct, and it is one of the few and only cases where the owner of 4chan actually censored 4chan and prevented any conversation on that subject. And you can see in the data where it just suddenly just disappears. It just cut off. And that was the moment that 8chan came into existence. So, I mean, you could. They went somewhere else. They went to 8chan, yeah. I don't know. I mean, the fact that it is an unpleasant thing, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be studied. I mean, it's no.
We have time for a couple more questions. One up here.
Hi. So, I mean, but given that, though, I mean, you talk about 4chan as sort of like birthplace of all of these sorts of really disgusting, horrible, nefarious ideas. But as we're just sort of kind of naming off these, extreme right-wing, cultural interpreters, if you want to call them that. I mean, I'm using the term really loosely here. Like, like the Steve Bannons, the Faith Goldies, those kinds of Alex Jones, those kinds of people who, take this stuff and then translate it in a way that becomes received by normies. I mean, if those people didn't exist, would there necessarily then be a reason to create this stuff in the first place? Because I'm concerned that there's like a sort of, I'm just wondering, like, can these, like, I don't study 4chan, but like, can these kinds of sort of assemblages that you would find on 4chan be like discussed as necessarily things in themselves, or are they at all times kind of responding to that sort? Because there's kind of like, it's sort of discussed in these kinds of terms as the sort of terms of like intimacy, like it's kind of protected away from the influences or the demands of culture outside. But I'm wondering if there would have been any reason to create Pizzagate in the first place if these kinds of people did not exist.
Yeah, I mean, they create stuff like this all the time, and then it just gets taken up when there's a demand out there. So there in 4chan, beyond being this place that is full of puerile discussions of all type. Well, actually, really of one type. It's also it's extremely innovative from a kind of the perspective of like computational linguistics. It just generates a lot of new stuff. It's unfortunate that it's mostly this kind of garbage, but it does do that, and that is, so it will always, as far as I can tell, because there is a lot of people go to it for that, because it's a really authentic internet subculture, in a time when there maybe aren't that many of those anymore. There used to be. And so it's a place where people go to participate in that, and it's at the moment in a kind of a reactionary phase. It wasn't like that before, and I don't know if it's a terminal condition, but I think that we have to also, we have to sort of look at it in a way as like dark fandom or something like that, right? Like it's an unpleasant thing, but it is a subculture. It's very productive. It gets weird when it goes outside of there. It's certainly upsetting in there. People sort of, there may be kind of translation issues. It's also possible that there are certain people in 4chan who are actually worse than the worst, because they, a little bit like in The Big Lebowski, like they believe in nothing, which actually makes them really terrifying. Like people like Weave and the guy who set up the Daily Stormer, who are like just pure kind of like just the worst kind of nihilism, and that is a frightening thing. But yeah, it is out there, and it's something that we kind of have to deal with. And I think that the relationship that has to actual violence and actual hate speech is not obvious, and it's quite difficult, and that's where the kind of work comes in kind of like disentangling like the sort of let's call them like extreme memes from like things that are actually dangerous. And I think that that's where work needs to be done. So
We have time for one last question. No pressure. No? Okay. All right. Well, not seeing any questions. Maybe it's time to wrap up the session and say thanks very much.
thank you very much.
Please take the cookies and whatever else is left there at the end of the room.